Good afternoon and welcome to the SILA Foundation June webinar, From Past to Progress, the Evolution of Adjuster Licensing. My name is Julie Mendel and I'm the Education Trustee for the SILA Foundation. Before introducing today's speaker, I have a few housekeeping items for everyone. Our webinar is 1 hour in length and is being recorded. Within the next week, you will receive a link to the recording and a post-webinar survey that we would appreciate you completing. We ask that you mute your microphones and turn off your videos so the focus stays on our speaker. We would also ask that you put your questions in the chat box. We will be monitoring and posing those questions to our speaker on your behalf at the end of her presentation. There's a lot of information going out today, so we will answer as many questions as we can in the time we have available, and we will, if there are still questions outstanding, we will address them via email after the webinar. Today, we're going to talk about the road to uniformity and how it's paved in frustration. But without understanding where we came from, it's really hard to see the progress we've made along the way. Today, Caitlin Small will provide an overview of adjuster licensing requirements, challenges, and hot topics while discussing the changes this license type has faced over the years. She will follow it up with what adjuster licensing faces in today's evolving regulatory space. Evolving is a pretty key word there. And best practices to avoid hiccups in the licensing process. Caitlin is a manager of regulatory compliance at Reg Ed. She's worked in the compliance space for over 10 years and is a subject matter expert in licensing and registration requirements with a focus on producer, adjuster, reinsurance, intermediary, and agency licensing. At Reg Ed, Caitlin assists the registration and licensing teams with licensing transactions and regulatory issues. She monitors state regulatory changes and is in constant communication with state divisions of insurance on issues that arise during the licensing process. She holds a degree from North Carolina State University. She's a member of SILA and is the chair of the SILA Adjuster Licensing Subgroup. And she also holds a SILA Associate designation. So please join me in welcoming Caitlin Small back to our virtual webinar stage.
Thank you, Julie. Thank you. Welcome, everybody. I'm Caitlin Small. I'm the manager of regulatory compliance here at Reg Ed. If you've attended these before, you know I love to talk about adjuster licensing, and today is going to be no different. And I know a lot of you guys have attended my previous ones. So when I was asked to do this again, I asked Julie, I said, I want to keep this interesting. I want to make sure that this is current. Because I'm reaching a lot of the same people that like to learn from these things. What are some of the hot topics people like to want to hear about, so I can kind of taper the content for that? And she said, the types of adjusters, continuing education, and designated home state. And I'm like, okay, cool. That's what we're always talking about. And then I realized, why don't we do that? We talk about these things all the time, over and over and over again, but they have changed throughout the years. And this presentation is kind of going to focus on kind of how things used to be, where they are now, and as well as moving forward. I do know that a lot of you are attending this because, as you guys know, Iowa is going to be licensing adjusters as of July 1st. That is going to be included in the presentation. I have saved it for the second half. So the first half is going to be kind of what the original plan for the presentation was. So I just wanted to know that the Iowa stuff is coming. The first half, I'm not going to talk about Iowa. It's just going to be too confusing to try and explain adjuster requirements that are complicated to begin with, and then explain Iowa along the way. So I'll kind of walk through the first half, and then we'll kind of focus strictly on Iowa in the second half. So all of that said, to get started, adjuster licensing 101. So what are the adjuster license types? These are going to be the 4 adjuster license types that you're going to see kind of in the industry in this space. I'm mainly going to focus on those independent and staff adjuster licenses in this presentation. And these are also going to be the ones you're going to see in the SILA resources. That independent adjusters are individuals who are associated with an adjusting firm that are hired to adjust losses on behalf of insurance companies. So they can represent one insurance company or multiple insurance companies. But the staff adjuster individuals are going to be those that are direct salaried employees of carriers. So these are individuals that are only handling those companies' claims. And that's going to be basically kind of the main difference of those two. One is that it's basically they're doing the same job. It's who they're working on behalf of. Public adjusters, I do like to mention because, again, they are an adjuster type. That's not really something we talk about a lot here because they're very niche. These are individuals who are hired by the insured. They represent the insured. These are kind of brought in when there's, the policyholder might be wanting kind of a second opinion or a third party kind of to review their situation if they don't agree with how the claim has been handled or estimated with their existing adjuster. And then emergency CAT adjusters are kind of a weird hybrid where if a person who is otherwise qualified to adjust claims but not licensed in the state where a catastrophe has been declared, there's a bit of a modified process. So you're a Texas resident, a hurricane hits Florida, but you don't have a license there. And you're called to handle those claims. That doesn't mean you can just go there and do whatever you want. It's just a modified process. Instead of obtaining the full license, you can do a registration. It's limited in scope to being only able to handle claims from the catastrophe because basically the thought is all hands on deck. We just need to get people in the door to touch the claims. I will not be talking about those, but if you are interested in learning more about them, the topic of the webinar I did last year is about strictly CAT adjusters, and we can get you kind of the link to that if you are interested in learning more. So this is kind of just a look at what the state licensing offerings are from a country, looking at from a high level look here of which states license what adjusters. So your purple states are those only independent adjuster licensing states. The yellow ones license staff and independent adjusters. The white states are states that don't offer either of these license types. And then Nevada offers three. They kind of define their staff a little bit differently. So they offer staff, independent, and then what's traditionally your company is an optional license in that state. So that's why it's kind of colored a little bit differently there. And so what adjuster you are is going to depend on the volume of states that you're going to be getting a license in or needing a license in. And this is kind of a breakdown of what that's going to look like. So of all the states that license adjusters, there's 18 that are just strictly independent adjuster only. These states typically have the language in their requirements that staff adjusters are exempt under the guidelines. But then there's the 16 states that license both. And in adjuster licensing, nothing can be uniform. So there's two different ways that this works. There's 12 states that offer one adjuster license type that encompasses both of those licenses. So Texas, for example, offers the adjuster license so that it doesn't matter if you're an independent or a company. That's the adjuster license that you get. They issue it. It's just depending on who you're working for is what kind of dictates that work for you. But there's four that offer two separate adjuster license types. And that's Kentucky, New Mexico, West Virginia, and then Nevada, which offers those three. So those are kind of the four that you need to make sure you're not just clicking through the application, that you are applying for the correct thing, because I know that happens a lot, that some people don't, they just see adjuster, they click it, they apply for it, not realizing, oops, I submitted the wrong thing. Those are the four states that offer a separate license type depending on which adjuster you are. In this kind of same space is the lines of authority. The most common lines of authority you're going to see on these licenses is going to be property, casualty, workers' comp, and crop. Crop I included it there because it is a very common line of authority, but it's very niche. It's got a federal requirement usually tied to it. A lot of the people that handle property, casualty, workers' comp don't handle crop. So when we kind of talk about in all lines, it's usually from a perspective of property, casualty, and workers' comp. But of course, that's not uniform. It's going to depend on what the state kind of defines that line of authority. And there's not a uniform approach to this. Some states name their lines of authority just all lines or none. And there's not really a line on the license that defines what that is. Some states offer a limited to resident state. So if you are only have workers' comp in your home state and you're obtaining a license in a state that offers this line of authority, just means you can only do what you have in your home state. And then you have these limited lines that are limited in scope that kind of create their own challenges that are typically around motor vehicle, accident, health, auto. And that can kind of become a little bit of an issue if you're trying to obtain property casualty in other states with that, because those are a lot more kind of focused in scope. New York is about the king of states that offer these. They offer 10 separate adjuster LOAs. So that is something to keep in mind if you're looking at, maximum reciprocity here is kind of picking the line that's going to get you the most, accessibility in other states. And then workers' comp is its own kind of beautiful niche little nightmare. For those of you that handle workers' comp know, each state handles it very differently. So there are a handful of states that do not license this. It's not offered or managed by the insurance division. It's managed by a different division, like the Division of Labor. So that can kind of become an issue if you need to handle claims in a state, but your resident state doesn't offer this. And then some states define their casualty line to include workers' comp under it. So these people have property and casualty in their resident state, but they can handle workers' comp, which makes it a bit of a difficult conversation when you're applying for a non-resident state where you can handle all lines, but they think you can only do PC. So I could spend an hour talking about workers' comp, but for the sake of time, this is kind of just a high-level overlook of kind of those changes over the years regarding those license types and lines of authority. Lines of authority, there was a time where some states didn't offer workers' comp. So we are kind of progressing in a direction of uniformity there. But these, we work in an industry that you can't really make these changes without a bill passing or a reg change, which has its own process that it needs to go to. But when we talk about, the low hanging fruit of what possibly can we do without having to go through that whole process, and some states have that ability of being able to modify what their license looks like or reports as. And there's been some changes of kind of defining those lines on the license from a none to a line of authority, such as property and casualty, to kind of add more states to the list to make this clearer as adjuster licensing can be. And it's also safe to say that just because a state makes a change doesn't mean they can't change it back. Rhode Island is on here twice. They, prior to 2015, had one adjuster license type. And then in 2015, we're like, let's go ahead and offer two separate ones. That makes sense. You just pick the one that is applicable to you. And then in 2018, they said, never mind, we're not doing that anymore. What ended up happening is people don't know what they're applying for. People change jobs. It's a manual process to switch those license types. So in 2018, they switched that back to just one adjuster license type. What works for one state might not work for the other. West Virginia has split those. They had one license type and in 2021, they split the two different ones. And it seems to be working successfully for them. So just because one state makes one change doesn't mean they can't necessarily change it back. So for those filing requirements and reciprocity challenges, it's going to depend on what type of adjuster you are, is what you're going to kind of face. Independent adjusters are going to have more challenges than your staff adjusters or company adjusters because you have a lot more states to deal with. A lot more states means a lot more personalities, a lot more requirements. There's, across the board for independent adjusters, additional filing requirements are the only appointment state you're going to need to worry about is Florida. They have an appointment requirement for all of their licenses. And then there's affiliations that are needed for those 5 states. New Mexico is listed out as independent only, need to worry about affiliations because again, New Mexico is a state that offers both. Don't worry about that as a staff adjuster. Reciprocity and retaliation, which sounds very aggressive, is very kind of common in this side of the adjuster space. And that's because New York, California, and Hawaii are kind of the big 3 players there. I don't like to call them out, but they are the ones that have, everyone has to take a test to get a license there. So there are a handful of states that have rules or regs that say we will reciprocate on the basis that that state offers the same reciprocity with our residents. Because North Carolina residents have to take a California, New York exam, Hawaii exam, they're going to make those individuals take the North Carolina exam, and those are going to be those states. Sometimes, depending on if you have completed an exam in a reciprocal state, that will be accepted, but that just kind of depends on what your license history looks like there. CE is going to be, I'll talk about that in a little bit. CE is another issue in this space because some states don't have a CE requirement. So that becomes a bit of a headache figuring out how to tell other states where you're doing your hours. And then workers' comp is kind of self-explanatory for that one. And then the staff adjusters are a lot more streamlined. You have less states you have to worry about. So it's 16 states plus Georgia is a registration. So Georgia's not listed on here as a license because it's technically a registration. It's a registration with the carrier you represent on the portal. So I don't want you guys thinking there's nothing that's needed. There is a process there. It's just not a license. And then Nevada is that state that offers the 2 different license types. Your filing requirements, Florida appointment is going to be something that is needed for you guys as well. And then that New Mexico staff adjusters have to do the appointment, not an affiliation. No affiliations for the staff company adjusters because the states that require them are the independent only states. So that's pretty streamlined. And this side of the adjusting space was pretty kind of smooth sailing for a while. The understanding was that if you were, say, a Michigan resident and you were a staff adjuster, all that's offered in Michigan is an independent adjuster license. So the typical understanding was that you would get a Texas DHS because your resident state doesn't offer the license that you need. And that was the guidance for a very long time until a couple summers ago. So these three states kind of came out with reviewed their rules and reciprocity requirements and have kind of shifted this area, stating that if a staff adjuster must obtain an independent adjuster license in their resident state, if their resident state does not restrict them from getting that license. So in that example, if that Michigan resident would need a license in these states, they would need to get the Michigan independent adjuster license and not the Texas DHS. This is still a topic of discussion. I know that carriers are still kind of struggling with how to handle this with their staff. It's not a one size fits all approach in that. I know that it's, your choices kind of are, do we just switch the claims around and not get those people licensed in those states, but so that they can keep their DHS, or do we convert them? Both of those come with their own set of challenges. That this is probably the biggest one that the staff company adjusters need to worry about or handle. And it wasn't fair to continue speaking without addressing it for those that might not be aware of it. There have not been any other states that have joined this kind of provision that they've detailed here. But it is something that we do keep an eye on because we know that, this isn't necessarily going away. So it's something we are keeping an eye on with it. And then application submission. I know that technology has its own challenges, but I just want to take a moment to appreciate that every state has an electronic option to submit, which is vastly different than where things were 10 years ago. Everyone has an option of either the state website, NIPR, CERCON. Never used to be that way. And many years ago, it was two different processes depending on if you had a resident or a DHS. And I think those of you that were around that filed these remember all the paper applications you had to submit with checks. And so it is very exciting that we all have the electronic options now, because most people also don't have a printer. So that solves that problem in figuring out how to file those applications. So designated home states, this is something that's unique to adjusters. It essentially was created to solve the problem of, I am a Colorado resident. Colorado does not license adjusters. I need to handle claims in non-resident states. How do I do that without having a resident license? So designated home state was created to kind of solve that problem, where you would pick a state that licenses adjusters and qualify for that as if you were a resident, and then use that as your kind of launching off point. And I get asked a lot, what is the best DHS to pick? And I don't like answering that because there's not a simple answer. But the main things that you can kind of look for when you're picking a DHS is these main three things. You want to make sure that there's an exam requirement, or that you have to qualify with some kind of designation. States are going to want to know how you qualified, that you took an exam, that you were approved for that license. Background checks and fingerprints are important to take note of. A lot of states are kind of making sure that that was completed in a home state. And then CE is another thing that is important. 22 DHS states have a CE requirement. Almost all of the states that offer a DHS mirror the CE requirement of the resident license, with the exception of those two states listed there. Georgia DHSs do not have a CE requirement. Georgia residents do, but the DHS does not. And the Kentucky staff adjuster DHS does not have a CE requirement. So things to keep in mind as you're looking at picking DHS states. And then the common pitfalls that kind of come with that of just be mindful of reciprocity. Just because a state can be a DHS doesn't mean it might not be the best fit. And then states that have specific DHS reciprocity. These states have kind of gone through the list, and if you don't have a DHS that is on this list, they will not issue you a license. So if you have needs of handling claims in those states, don't try to take the shortcut and pick a DHS that's not on the list. It's just going to make more work for you. And Alaska and Arizona do not recognize DHS. It doesn't matter which one you have. It's just DHS in general. So those will need exams to obtain those licenses. If you do have a DHS, Arizona accepts a few designations in lieu of an exam, but Alaska, it is strictly that state exam. And then states that cannot be used as a DHS are the ones that are listed there. I can't tell you how many times I see people use in New York. I guess because an exam's required, but if that's a choice, if that's what you're doing, because you're not supposed to be doing it, and it's a lot of reciprocity challenges. And once upon a time, we didn't have a DHS specific license type. You just used a non-resident license and you just told everyone that was your DHS. And we all just kind of hoped that was, you were being honest, and it was a little bit of the Wild West. And that has come a long way too over the years. But when it kind of got rolled out, there's not a uniform way to do it. Texas had their individuals reapply for it as a DHS specific license. Georgia said, we're just converting everyone who took our exam into having a DHS. And then Florida requested carriers and firms to submit individuals that needed to be converted. And that's how they were able to isolate that population. And one of the things that has been great about having DHS licenses and reporting is it's a lot easier to see where the DHS is. And there's two fields to look at on PDV when you're looking for this: license class and this designated home state field on the PDB, depending on which state you're looking at. We'll have that listed there. Some best practices with this is going to be just, verify the DHS of your individuals when you're onboarding them. You don't know what the practice was for their license before you hired them. So their licenses might be reporting multiple DHSs, could be all over the place, just easier to clean up. Verifying that the DHS at the time of renewal is the correct one. And then just being mindful of submitting applications that you're selecting the right DHS. You don't want your application to get rejected or there to be any kind of delay in processing because of an error like that. So continuing education, CE requirements vary across states. Again, I hate to say that nothing's uniform in adjusters because that's kind of a given, but that's the same for continuing education. The general CE requirements tend to be the 24 hours and 3 ethics. Most of the states have this, but there are varying hours, which can impact reciprocity. So Delaware is a state that has 12 hours. I know so many people that try to take that as I'm going to use it as my DHS because it's the least amount of hours, not realizing that that's not the best choice. Most states want to see that 24 hours is being completed, and Delaware being half of that causes a little bit of a challenge there. Florida reduces to 20 hours after 6 years of licensure. And then there's a handful of states that can waive the CE if you have not, if you've held your license for an extended period of time. And then, of course, the CE requirements are going to vary by those states. Georgia DHS and Kentucky staff DHS does not have a CE requirement. And then those 5 states there that are in the yellow are going to be those states that do not have a CE requirement. And that goes across the board for the residents, the DHS. They don't have it for adjusters at all. Vermont is a state that doesn't require CE for their PC adjusters and their workers' comp adjusters. It's not really a CE requirement. It's a workers' comp specific training that is tied to the renewal. So I didn't want anyone attending this thinking they don't have to do anything. There is a requirement. And again, workers' comp, it's its own bear to deal with. But there is a uniform question that is on the application that asks about CE. I believe this is triggered for the designated home state individuals. That asks where you're doing your CE. So this is something that states do want to know about. They want to know where you're completing it, that they do keep that information. And if you are a resident of a state that doesn't have a CE requirement, a lot of states will want to know where you're doing it, and they might want to see proof of a transcript. So it's kind of a weird situation where you would designate another state that has a requirement as a CE, but not obtain them as a DHS. It's just that's the state you've picked to do your CE. And then you can report that completed transcript to the other states that are requesting that. And CE is another thing that is one of the hardest things, I think, for states to kind of approve or be able to get past. But there has been 6 states that have done this over the past however many years, that is 7, 8 years. It's, I know Jeff in the state of Washington said that it took them about 9 years to get this passed. And I think Rhode Island, Rachel said it was about 3 years. So it's not for lack of trying for these states that don't have CE requirements. I think that the residents in that state don't want them to have a CE requirement. But when we're talking about getting licenses in all the states, that it would be a perfect world if every single state had a uniform CE requirement. But things would not be as interesting as they are in this side of the business if we had that perfect a uniform CE requirement. And then I know that this is kind of a common statement that adjusters, they're like, what, I have to complete 24 hours of CE and for every 2 years, that's so many hours. How am I going to get this done? Things could always be worse. Back before 2015, Texas had a 30-hour CE requirement, and that was broken up into 15 hours every year. I think part of that was they had to be classroom hours. So they did change that in September of 2015, but prior to that, it was a 30-hour requirement. And that kind of created a little bit of a challenge for people who had a resident or DHS that only had a 24-hour requirement, because it was, how do I satisfy Texas? I'm short 6 hours. So then that created a whole other problem where everyone was using Texas. Everyone's flooding Texas paper application, backlog of filings became a whole thing that luckily they reverted to the 24-hour model, and that became not an issue. But anytime the next time you hear somebody saying, that's so many hours I have to do, it could always be worse. And it would probably be easier to complete those hours if they did not wait to the last minute, but you can only control what you can control sometimes. So that being said, this is now, I'm going to start talking about Iowa. So Iowa, for those that don't know, Iowa is the first state since I've been doing this that has implemented an adjuster licensing requirement. So that's at least over the last 13 years. I'm just curious as to which state was the last one to join, out of just kind of curiosity, but this has become kind of a hot topic of discussion. There was a bill that was passed in April, and if you were on the SAL's adjuster call last month, the original guidance was that everyone's going to have to test. It doesn't matter if you're resident, non-resident, everyone's going to have to test for this license. And that was kind of stemming from the original guidance, from the language in that bill that said, we will only reciprocate if you took a test that included Iowa laws and regs, which no other state is going to test on Iowa laws and regs except Iowa. And so that was kind of the understanding until earlier this month, when additional guidance came out, kind of that they reviewed this a little bit more. They were able to find that they could have us do a modified process for licensing, and that the original guidance of everyone's going to have to take a test isn't necessarily applicable. So this portion of the presentation is kind of going to detail what that process looks like. It's based on the information in this second half is going to be kind of pulled from the resources that I was provided from their state website, from the bulletins, the multiple forms they've created, as well as just kind of communication that we've had with Iowa on this. And this is kind of the best understanding of what that process is going to look like moving forward. I know there's a lot of moving parts to this. It's very fluid. I know that this bill kind of caught all of us off guard. And sometimes when these things pass, you're kind of stuck with the language in it, and you got to work with the confines that you got. We wish it might have had different requirements, but this is kind of what they have to deal with, and we have to work with that as well. And Iowa did just want to say that if there's any questions, to email them. When in doubt, email them. That's their email address up on the screen. I will do my best to answer the questions that I can. I know Julie's going to keep track of those. If I cannot get to them, I will try to get to them afterwards via email, but I will answer the questions as I can. And hopefully this will be helpful, because I know that there are a lot of questions kind of around what this looks like. So Iowa new licensing requirements. So how did this come about? So Senate File 619 was passed on the 22nd of April. It was introduced on the 2nd and passed in 20 days. So by the time I think all of us realized that the reality is, oh my gosh, there's going to be a new state here that we're going to have to figure out how to fit into this moving, everyone else that's licensed, we didn't have time to process that before it was already passed. And so what essentially it did was it created 7 new license types that will require licenses. And the individuals, it's going to be independent adjusters, appraisers, and umpires. Staff adjusters are offered, but those are optional. That is key as I go through this, that those staff adjusters are going to be optional. Business entities are also optional in Iowa. So those business entity licenses that are being created are public adjuster, independent adjuster, and appraiser. I'm only going to speak to the individual independent and staff adjuster filing process. I know that there's some questions on the SILA board of appraiser requirements and umpires. I included those because they kind of play in the same wheelhouse with us. There is additional information on filing processes for those in Bulletin 2504 that Iowa has on their website, as well as in our SILA resources. If you want to reference that to kind of read a little bit more of what those are going to look like. But just some stuff to kind of keep in mind as I go through this here is that Iowa cannot be used as a DHS. So don't think about doing it. Don't consider it. It's not a thing. And the exam vendor is going to be Pearson VUE. One thing about Iowa is they have a very short exam validity window. Most states, the scores are good for a year, but Iowa, it is 90 days. So if you have an individual that's going to take the test, make sure you're filing that application timely because you don't want to be the one to tell them you got to do it again. Fingerprint vendor is going to be Field Print, and I'll get to that in a little bit as I go through this. And this is effective July 1st. So in a couple days, this is what we're all going to be filing. So now that we know there's a requirement, what exactly do I need to do? And that is a loaded question. So this impacts adjusters depending on which group you are going to fall into. And this is for both staff and independents. Remember, staff is optional. So Group A is going to be those individuals who have been providing adjuster services in Iowa or any other state prior to the first of this year. Group B is individuals who have been providing adjuster services in Iowa or any other state after the first of the year, but before July 1st. And Group C and D are kind of going to work more traditionally like a standard filing process. Those are going to be your first-time applicants for residents. That's after July 1st. If you have no experience, no licenses, it's going to follow more of a first-time filing process. Same with Group D, first-time non-resident applicants. If you don't qualify for Group A and B and you have a home state license, that's going to be the filing process you're going to follow. When does this go into effect? When do I need to file? It depends on what you're doing. There's a transition period for filing that is between July 1st and October 1st, and a post-transition period, which is October 1st and moving forward. And how you do that is going to depend on which group you're going to fall into. So before I talk about each group specifically, we got to talk about the supporting documentation that will be needed during this process. And that is going to, let me send this, see if I can send this in the chat while I'm working here. These forms, Iowa has created new forms that I'm putting in the chat so you can follow along if you have not seen these or just want to reference them, that have been created for this. And I've tied them to which group these are going to be applicable for. There is a modified licensing process attestation form. There is a waiver request of required experience, which this I'll talk to in a minute about this group, is that this form doesn't guarantee that you will not have to take the exam. There is an exam exemption attestation form, which is going to be for those non-residents that don't fall into Group A or B. Supporting documentation, pretty straightforward with this. $50,000 surety bond is applicable for all these adjuster applicants. I know there was confusion on whether or not those staff adjusters need this. They do. It is the $50,000 bond is required for independents, staff, and public. And then fingerprint requirement is the same. All applicants need to complete fingerprints. The exception is if you have satisfied that in another state, you do not have to do them in Iowa. So the application, things to keep note of, email address for Iowa is listed there. That's going to come important for supporting documentation submission. And some of these cannot be done on NIPR. So the application will need to be submitted via the Iowa State portal, which I know is a little bit different of a process for a lot of us. So for this transition filing period for July 1st and October 1st, these Group A individuals need to follow this process. And these are going to be those ones that have been providing adjusting services. And it doesn't have to strictly be in Iowa. It can be any other state prior to the first of this year. So you have experience, great. Follow this process. It's a little bit easy. So your only option is to file on the Iowa State website. NIPR is not an option. This group gets the modified licensing process attestation form, and this will need to be emailed to Iowa after the application is submitted. For the sake of uniformity, because I know there's a lot of you that are going to be doing this, Iowa would prefer if we could include the adjuster's applicant's name and NPN, if applicable, in the subject line, just to keep this very easy, because that email box is going to be flooded with all of these forms. Bond, you can upload straight to the application. There is a button there that you can upload it. Fingerprints, again, that's going to be depending on if you need to do them, if they're waived or not. But if you do need to do them, the application needs to be submitted first. This is because there is a specific fingerprint code that is provided after application submission that is needed when you complete the prints. So don't do the prints beforehand. You're not going to want to have to do them again. Wait until you file the application, wait for the email for additional information, then schedule the fingerprints. So a little bit of clarification about what this Group A means here, of who can qualify for this. Non-residents, you need a resident or DHS. Because Iowa can't be used as a DHS, you can't just apply for it as a non-resident and have it floating out there without any kind of underlying license. You have to have a resident or DHS in order to apply for this way. Residents are able to apply without any licenses. I believe that's kind of under the understanding that it's, if you are an Iowa resident, you might not have a license anywhere, because that might be all that you do. So if you want a non-resident license and you qualify this way, you have to have a resident or DHS. Those that are applying for Iowa resident licenses do not have to have a license. Very important. I know that this is a question is, well, what do I do with the claims that I'm handling here after July 1st? If you are applying or you qualify in this group, the bulletin states that you can continue to provide services as an adjuster until a licensing decision is provided by the DOI, as long as you apply no later than October 1st. So it is very critical that these people are prioritized so that you don't have to worry about what happens after October 1st. Similarly, Group B is kind of under the same filing process, just with a different form. So these individuals filing between July 1st and October 1st are those individuals that are providing adjuster services in Iowa or any other state after the 1st of this year, but before July 1st. Similar process where you can only submit on the Iowa State website. The bond is the requirement. You can upload that via the portal. And then fingerprint rule still applies. If you have to do them, submit your application, wait for that email, do your fingerprints afterwards. The main difference here is going to be the waiver request of required experience form. This form does not guarantee an exam waiver. It is possible, depending on the experience that you have provided, that your adjuster has, they might have to test. One of the questions that I know has been asked of me is there a minimum required experience that I was looking for? I think that's stemming from those of you that handle California know California has a set number of hours you have to meet for that experience requirement. That is not the case here. It is just subject to Iowa's review of the experience and the determination that they make on that. If the experience form is accepted, the application will be approved. If it's not, if they deem that you don't meet what they're looking for, you will be contacted with kind of the additional requirements of what you need to do to schedule that exam. Same kind of rules apply for that clarification. Non-residents, you need to have that resident or DHS. You can't just be having a non-resident license just float out there by itself. And then those residents that meet that experience requirement within that time frame are the ones that are unlicensed applicants that can qualify for that license there. Same rule applies on the bulletin. They can continue to provide adjusting services until a formal decision's been made, as long as the application was submitted no later than October 1st. And now these individuals are going to be a little bit more straightforward. So these are going to be your Iowa residents that have no experience, no licenses after July 1st. So you're an Iowa resident, you've been hired by an insurance firm that you're going to be an adjuster. You don't qualify for the A or B process. You got to apply as a first-time applicant. So what that's going to look like is the exam is going to be required. Pearson VUE is the exam provider. That is going to be available. My understanding is July 1st. There is not available scheduling right now. But once that exam is completed, please allow 3 business days before you try to apply. I know there's a lot of eager people out there that just want to get this filed and not have to worry about it. Don't bother Iowa. Don't bother NIPR. Allow a couple days for those exam results to be transmitted. Also, make sure those people are giving the correct social when they schedule for the exam. because if the social is incorrect, it's going to screw up trying to apply online. So make sure the social is correct and wait a couple days after it's passed to be able to submit. Exam score is only available, valid for 90 days. And the submission method is going to be NIPR. So once you complete your exam, you wait a couple days, submit your application via NIPR. That surety bond is still required. So you can send that to Iowa after the application is submitted. And then the fingerprints will be needed. Again, have to do those after the application is submitted so that you have that code and that Iowa gets the results of those fingerprints, because you don't want those results going somewhere else because they can't transmit them. If you send them to the wrong department, you're going to have to do your prints again. This is the first group that is going to have a fee. Those that are in Group A and Group B do not have the $50 fee. These individuals will have that $50 fee. And then the Group D individuals are going to be those non-residents who don't qualify for the Group A or Group B process, that are filing between July 1st and October 1st. NIPR or the state website are going to be your options depending on what your resident situation is. So non-resident applicants with the DHS will need to submit directly on the Iowa State website. There is not the capability right now with NIPR to submit as with your DHS. I know that is something they are prioritizing to kind of resolve, as this situation's been fluid. So as soon as there is an update on when that will be available, I'm sure we will be updated by Iowa, or the website will be updated. But that is one thing that to keep an eye on, that if you have DHS, it has to be through that state website. This is where that third form is going to come into play here, is the exam exemption attestation form. This is that third form that is needed for this grouping of individuals. So don't try to submit the modified forms for your new people that are in this group. Exam exemption attestation form goes with these new individuals after July 1st. $50,000 surety bond is going to be required, email or upload to NIPR. And then the fingerprint requirement, again, if you have not done that, you will be required to do it for Iowa. Again, same rule, make sure you apply first and then do them afterwards. So that is the process, for my understanding, and the what has been communicated from Iowa is the process leading up until October 1st. So what happens after October 1st? So because we are all going to file this timely and everyone's going to get us back our documents on time, everyone's going to file from Group A and Group B prior to October 1st. That is, after October 1st, that doesn't matter anymore. That process is not going to exist after October 1st. And those two forms, the modified licensing process form and the waiver of experience form, were only created for that transition period for those applicable groups. After October 1st, everyone essentially becomes the new resident applicant or a new non-resident applicant. And the only form that you need to worry about is this exam exemption attestation form. So how that kind of is going to work after October 1st, it's going to be just like Group B and Group C. So NIPR or the Iowa State website, depending on your resident DHS situation, residents going to have to take that exam. Non-residents have that specific form for completion. $50,000 surety bond, again, uniform for both groups. Your fingerprints are the same rules apply, where you don't have to do them if you've completed them somewhere else. $50 fee across the board for all applicants for the license. Again, just to reiterate that those that have a DHS are going to have to submit directly on the Iowa State website. Exam scores are only going to be valid for 90 days, and make sure you're looking in your email box for the field print code that is going to be needed to make sure those results are transmitted to the correct place. So the next question that I get, and I'm sure Iowa has gotten, is, all right, so now I've got my license, how do I maintain it? And let's take a breather on the renewal and the CE requirements. So the insurance code in the bill have referenced that the DOI may adopt rules necessary to administer and enforce insurance adjuster statute, which essentially means that they have the discretion of being able to determine how this is going to go. I think we are all just trying to survive until October 1st. that this is a process we can ask about after October. We all just need to get to the finish line before we can start asking about what we need to do to maintain the license. There will be a CE requirement. It's just kind of up to what Iowa is, how they're going to implement that. I know that's something that they're kind of figuring out and reviewing of what they're going to do in terms of the CE as well as the license renewal. It was, if you were on the sales adjuster call last month, the kind of thought process behind CE is that they are considering going with the public adjuster requirement for this group, which is a 24-hour with 2 ethics. It's not official. That is subject to change. That's just kind of what their original thought is on this. And of course, there's no DHS, so residents are going to have to do it. Don't worry about the DHS, but it's kind of yet to be seen on how non-residents are going to fall into this, because I know one of the questions is, well, what's Iowa going to do if I have a resident state that doesn't require CE? Is Iowa going to make me take their CE? We don't know yet. That's one of the things. So give Iowa some grace here on this. I know that we all are interested in renewals. I know we're all interested in CE. I know there's a lot of CE providers out there that want to know so that they can get the ball rolling on course creation. It's just kind of a little bit of a waiting game that we all just need to get through the next 90 days, 3 months, and then we can kind of focus on what this impact is going to look like throughout the license period moving forward. So kind of some frequently asked questions that I know people have probably asked, that what does this license line of authority cover? So I was advised that their line of authority is considered all lines in the sense that it's property, casualty, workers' comp. I'm not 100% if that means that the line of authority is just going to say adjuster or just none, but it is to be understood that it is property, casualty, and workers' comp. Adjusters that only do crop hail or multi-peril crop insurance adjusting are excluded. The follow-up question to that typically is, I hold a limited license in my home state. I only do workers' comp. I only have PC. What am I going to do if this is an all lines license? Iowa has communicated that because the license is not going to define the line of authority, there is going to be reciprocal issuance there. That's kind of the understanding for what to expect in starting 5 days from now. And then can I hold more than one adjuster license type? This question is more so stemmed from those individuals from a logistics standpoint of a filing process. Those states that offer both license types, some you can't hold both at the same time. So it kind of modifies the filing process of how do I apply for the independent when I still have a staff adjuster license. That's where this question kind of was coming from. And the guidance is that, yes, they can hold more than one adjuster license type at one time. I don't know why you would need both, but if you get somebody that has the one that they don't need and they need the other one, it shouldn't necessarily impact that filing process to be able to submit or terminate the other license. And then the other question is there a requirement for CAT or emergency adjusters? There is. It's section 522C.2 of the insurance code has a definition for CAT adjusters, but additional information is going to be provided, eventually by the Iowa DOI. Again, this is something that they're still trying to navigate themselves. I know it's been a lot. It's been an evolving situation. So as soon as that is available, we will probably have access to that via their website or via a bulletin of some kind. So more to come on the CAT adjusters, so that just so you know that it is coming. There's just not a lot of information about that right now. Another question that kind of has come out of this is, what about appointments or affiliations? Those are not required. So it's going to keep that, at least you don't need to worry about that. On the application, I have not actually submitted any applications yet, but I have looked at the application that there is a section that when you go through it, that's going to ask for affiliations. It's going to look like it's required. There's a button to exit out. So don't panic when you get in there and you see that there's a button to exit out, that it looks like it's required. They do not require affiliations. Don't panic. You don't need to worry about that. Just close out the little button and then continue with the application. And then, of course, those business entity and staff adjuster licenses are going to be optional, depending on kind of if you guys choose to proceed that way or not. Those are optional licenses. And then just kind of a quick adjuster regulatory update before we get to questions. Adjuster regulatory update here is just some things that are moving throughout the rest of the country. Not as exciting as creating an entirely new license type. Georgia has something pending that could potentially repeal the pre-licensing education requirement for adjusters. So there's not a lot of states that have a pre-licensing requirement. So if this passes, there will be even less states. New York has their annual bill that they have introduced that would waive the requirements of the exam if somebody holds a designation. This is something they introduce every year and it never goes through. So again, it might this year, but I'll believe it when I see it. South Carolina has a bill pending that would add a CE requirement for adjusters. Again, this is something that will be the most impactful for those residents there. If it passes, it would have a 24-hour requirement with the 3 ethics every 2 years. So very standard along with what everything else is, but that still has not moved recently. And then Texas, this isn't adjuster related, but again, it plays in the same conversation here, is that they have a bill that would implement an appraiser and an umpire licensing requirement. Texas is the second state I've seen that's introduced something like this, next to Iowa. So I don't know if umpires are something that is kind of gaining traction in this space that is now kind of being scrutinized of wanting to have them licensed. But if this passes, exams and CE would be required for those licenses. So just to kind of talk about some additional adjuster educational opportunities, if you want to learn more about adjuster licenses, we have SILA Foundation pre-conference classes are coming up. These are being hosted by myself and Melissa Britton of Adjuster Pro on August 7th and 8th. It's a 4-hour class split up over 2 days, where we're kind of going to go over in more detail some of the adjuster basics that I spoke about here. And then a lot of this is kind of interactive based, where we have a lot of scenarios to kind of throw at you guys to discuss amongst the other classmates of how you would handle it if you've seen that situation before, and discuss it so that if you haven't seen it before, you can kind of be a little bit more prepared for when it does arise. There is a prerequisite for this where you must complete the adjuster licensing basics course. So if you haven't done that, that is a prerequisite, or there is an exemption that will apply for students who provide proof of holding a minimum of 3 years of adjuster licensing experience. So if that's something you're interested in, you can reach out to SILA, myself, Mary Ellen, and we can get you enrolled. I think enrollment goes up until about like 48 hours before the class starts. So not something you have to think about now, but that is an opportunity. And then if you guys are SILA members and you are going to the National Education Conference, we do have 2 adjuster-specific sessions that will be available. That one is going to be a panel session that is on the first day. We're going to talk about how addresses impact the whole process of an adjuster's licensing experience. So, if you work from home, what that kind of looks like there from a business address perspective, how that impacts whether or not you're going to have to do pre-licensing, whether or not you have to do CE, and what, lines of authority offerings come from that based on your resident state. And then our second day is going to be the Adjuster Open Forum, which is more of kind of a kind of freestyle session where if there's conversation from the panel session beforehand, we can continue that conversation. And if you have any questions about, something that you're dealing with and you want to see how other regulators feel about it, or how other industry members would handle that, or if they've experienced that, it kind of creates an open discussion of various topics of kind of helping one another out in the filing challenges that we all face in the adjuster space. And so with that, I think I am all finished with my portion. Julie, I'm sure there's probably a lot of questions in the chat.
There are a lot. We've had a super interactive group. So some of them have been answered by people in the chats as well. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the ones that I didn't see an answer for, but we'll still address these via email afterwards because we're down to the last
close,
time. Yeah. Okay. Can you clarify the difference between independent and staff adjusters? I work for an insurance company and handle all the licensing. I always considered them as independent adjuster as opposed to public adjusters.
So that's going to be the main difference is going to be kind of who they're representing. And I know that's that's a common question of what is kind of the definition of a staff adjuster, and that's kind of going to boil down to what their job duties are and who they're working for. But essentially that the staff adjuster definition is essentially that somebody who works for, I'm pulling up the slides here so that I can read it from what I had it listed as, is a person who is an employee of an insurance company, performs various functions handled in a company's claims, and is a direct salaried employee, a direct salaried adjuster of the insurance company. Independent is somebody who is hired on behalf of insurance companies to adjust those losses. That's kind of the main difference there. Any kind of more specifics, it's kind of going to boil down to what the individual situation specifically is. I don't know if that
Okay, and just so everybody knows, the slide deck will be available when we send out the link to the recording. So some of this information, I know we had to go really fast through some of it. You'll be able to reference back in the slide deck. That's been asked a couple times in the chat. And yes, you will have access to the slide deck afterwards. Okay, next question. If you have a DHS license that does not require fingerprints, example, New Hampshire, and you are also licensed in another state that does require fingerprint and does background checks, like Florida, and you were fingerprinted for Florida, will that satisfy Iowa for fingerprint background?
The way that the forms read and the application reads is that if it's completed in another state, so that is the current understanding, is that if it's completed in another state, that satisfies that. If that changes or if that is not the understanding, I'm hopeful that Iowa will clarify that. But the way that all of the documentation reads is that if it's completed in another state, it doesn't look like it has to specifically be your resident or DHS.
Okay, next question. Can we amend these forms if we are not utilizing the appraiser or umpire?
Amend the forms to complete the I don't.
That's all I've got.
Okay, I was gonna say I don't know. I don't think I necessarily understand the question, but if it's regarding the, I know that those forms are applicable for the appraisers and the umpires. I've looked at these forms a million times the past couple of weeks, that there is a portion in there with links to the appraiser and umpire applications. So just double check that bulletin, but I believe these forms, if appraisers and umpires qualify for the modified process, those are the applicable forms that would be needed.
Okay, do you have an approved form for the bond language?
I was waiting for that one. No, there is not an approved form. So my understanding from Iowa is that they will not have a specific form for those of you that had to file those New Mexico bonds several years ago. New Mexico had provided a state specific bond form that we all had to use. Iowa has not created that. I do not believe they are creating one. I know for the clients that I assist with that we kind of have been working directly with their underwriting company to kind of formulate what that looks like based on the Iowa guidance. And so that would kind of be my recommendation, is work with your bond company directly and see if you guys can kind of formulate a communication to work with Iowa on what needs to be included in that bond so that it is accepted.
Okay, we have a whole bunch more questions, but we are right at our time right now. Please email any questions that you have to Mary Ellen. Her email is in the chat. Mary Ellen, if you could drop it in the chat again, that'd be great. I've got some of the questions copied and put in a document. We're going to try to address everybody.
I'll do my best.
And, Caitlin, thank you so much for sharing your expertise on adjuster licensing. So much information, ever changing. We really do appreciate you. We love that you're such a good friend to SILA and the SILA Foundation, and the amount of time that you spend supporting us is fantastic. As a reminder to everyone else, our webinars are free of charge. They are open to the public. We really love it when you share our invitations. Please watch for and complete that post-webinar survey. When Caitlin said at the top of the webinar, she asked me what people wanted. I pulled that information directly from those survey results. So if you want specific information or specific topics,
we do read those, yes.
Yes, I read every single one of them. And so please join us next month. We're going to have a webinar on CE best practices, and we hope to see you there. Everybody have a great holiday coming up.
Thank you guys. Take care.